Welcome to the 9th episode in a Legendarium series about the life and reign of King Edward III of England. In Part 9, When Glory Perished, we will talk about the twilight years of King Edward III, when his conquests in France began to fall apart. During the 1360s, King Edward and Queen Philippa spent most of their time with their household at hunting lodges in the New Forest as they slowly descended into old age. He continued to host great state events, most notably a 1364 event in London, which included the Kings of Scotland, France, and Cyprus. Parliament also passed laws which set what ranks of society could wear and forbade the lower orders from wearing furs, cloaks, or pointy shoes. Yet the world beyond the royal palace changed fast. In 1364, King John II of France died, and his son Charles V took the throne. King Charles V tore up the Treaty of Calais, which granted the English much of western France. Edward responded by resuming the title King of France, but he showed little of his former vigor in meeting this new trouble. As Edward III became increasingly old and infirm, he left most of the fighting and the governing of his overseas territory to his sons Edward the Black Prince and John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. The two royal sons struggled against King Charles' lieutenant Bertrand du Guesclin, who fought against the English for 2 decades. Coming from a family of poor knights, the French nobles mocked Bertrand as a hog in armor. Yet instead of fighting chivalric wars, Bertrand became a master of hit-and-run tactics and wars of attrition. He first fought the English not in France, but Spain. Civil war had erupted in Castile. Pedro the Cruel, described as a vile evildoer and a tyrant, wished to defend his throne against his father's 10 illegitimate sons, the 2 oldest of whom became his most implacable enemies. Pedro would have had an easier time of it if he hadn't infuriated his subjects with arbitrary murders and the shameful treatment of his wife, Blanche, sister to the King of France. Pedro married Blanche despite having already wed one of his mistresses, and he abandoned then imprisoned Blanche shortly thereafter, before killing her with a crossbow bolt to the eye. He was also said to have killed a man for looking at him the wrong way, and once burned a woman alive for rejecting his advances. King Charles V of France wished to take on Pedro the Cruel for 2 reasons. First, to punish Pedro for allying with England instead of France. Second, King Charles V wanted to hire the companies of ex-English mercenaries who roamed his kingdom. They held entire cities for ransom, took over manor houses and monasteries as bases of operation, and even made their way into Italy and held the Pope hostage. Many French saw these free companies as a punishment sent by God. So King Charles V instead hired them to invade Castile, depose Pedro, and install one of his half-brothers, Enrique de Trastamara. By 1366, King Pedro the Cruel fled Castile for the court of Edward the Black Prince in Aquitaine, son of King Edward III. Of course, the soldier prince happily joined the Castilian War. According to legend, this was in part because Pedro the Cruel gave Edward the Black Prince a large gem that he obtained by robbing and murdering a guest in his own home. Today, it is still placed in the English crown. To further smooth things along, King Pedro gave over 2 of his daughters, Constance and Isabella, as collateral. Later, Constance would marry Edward's brother, John of Gaunt. However, the Black Prince had already been levying unpopular hearth taxes in Aquitaine to finance his lavish court, and people did not relish paying more for a Castilian war. Nonetheless, on January 6, 1367, Edward readied for war, and his wife, Princess Joan, gave birth to Edward's second son, Richard of Bordeaux. Richard's baptism was attended by King Pedro, King James IV of Majorca, and King Richard of Armenia, described by chronicler William Thorne as 3 magi. This and Richard's birth on Twelfth Night gave hope that he was destined for greatness. With his brother John of Gaunt at his side, Edward the Black Prince crossed the Pyrenees with his army and surprised Franco-Castilian forces led in part by Bertrand du Guesclin. Using a combination of heavy longbow fire and attacks by his men-at-arms, the Black Prince routed the Franco-Castilian army. About 5,000 French and Castilians died, many drowning when they tried to escape by swimming across a river. Though he restored Pedro to his throne, the Castilian king could not begin to repay the Black Prince for the cost of the Castilian campaign. The Black Death also swept through the English army during a hot Spanish summer, and the Black Prince himself contracted a grave disease, possibly malaria, which left him confined to bed most of the time. The Black Prince did capture some prisoners, including Bertrand du Guesclin. Yet the money he raised from this ransom could not begin to cover the campaign. With no choice, the Black Prince again raised taxes on his subjects in Aquitaine. The enraged nobles, mainly French speakers, appealed to King Charles V as sovereign lord of the Duke and the whole Duchy of Aquitaine. King Charles V sent French troops to the border of Aquitaine in late 1368, and by the spring of 1369, hundreds of towns had joined King Charles V and overthrew Plantagenet rule in most of the duchy. Family fortunes also collapsed in Castile. Enrique de Trastamara defeated his half-brother Pedro the Cruel in battle. During a post-battle dinner in his tent, Enrique suddenly drew a dagger and stabbed his half-brother to death. Soon afterwards, King Charles V signed an alliance with King Enrique of Castile, providing for a large war fleet that sailed up the English-held Gascon coast, spreading panic wherever it went. Back in England, Edward's wife of 40 years, Queen Philippa, grew plump and sickly. She dislocated her shoulder during an accident in 1357 and never fully recovered. From 1356 onward, she moved with increasing difficulty until finally being confined to a litter. Edward III fell into dotage and came under the spell of Alice Pereire, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Philippa. Alice became Edward's mistress and gave birth to Edward's illegitimate son while the queen still lived. Queen Philippa finally died in August 1369 at Windsor Castle at the age of 55. Edward visited her on her deathbed, and she asked Edward for 3 requests, never mentioning Alice Pereire's, whom she surely knew about. First, she asked her husband to ensure that all her gifts to churches remained intact. Second, she asked him to pay all her foreign creditors. And third, when he died, she asked that he be buried at her side in Westminster Abbey. Sobbing out loud, the king declared, "Lady, all this shall be done." Even as Queen Philippa was laid to rest, King Edward III must have known that his greatest days lay behind him. That wraps things up for this episode of the Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.